Welcome. Room 5, last session on Thursday, is not Mikhail Steib talking about advanced GraphQL stuff. So if anyone was hoping to learn anything interesting about how to query your web-based APIs and stuff, stick around anyway. I can't tell you how to make the queries work, but I will tell you how to make the results look pretty. Because this talk is a late change to the schedule. I found out I was doing this about an hour ago. And it's from hot metal to HTML, the story of typography. And you know that, because I have this title slide, and now I may be assuming that everyone in here can see and read English and everything. And this slide doesn't really say a great deal. What if I'd come up here and my title slide looked like this? Now, it's the same words in the same letters in the same alphabet, but this sends a slightly different message, doesn't it? This is like, oh, he's British. He must be from the Times of London. Let's see what he's going to say about it. And if I put this up, the people in the front are going, wow, this guy is really cool. Look at that. And the people at the back are going, what does that say? Or I could put this one up. Welcome to the castle of King Henry. Or this one, Full Metal Jacket. Or even this one, the Norwegian death metal font. Which is brilliant. I mean, you don't know what the talk is, who it's by, or what my email is, but you know it's going to be angry, right? Or we could go for Comic Sans, the world's most misunderstood typeface. And all of those, just the choice of font, sends a different kind of message about who I am and how I am expecting you to receive the information that I have displayed up here for you. And when we come full circle and we go back to this one kind of doesn't say anything. This is very, very neutral. And this is neutral by design. This font, this typeface, is called Frutiger. And it was created by this guy, Adrian Frutiger, one of the greatest type designers of the last century. And he was hired to create a font for the signs at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris in the 1960s. And Frutiger's perspective was that some fonts are supposed to be memorable. They are supposed to be decorative. But if you are putting up signs in an airport that people are relying on, the font shouldn't matter. He had this quote on it. He said, if you remember the shape of a spoon with which you just ate some soup, then the spoon had a poor shape. And if any of you have ever been like, that's a bad spoon. Like, as a tool, it doesn't really work because it's trying to be pretty. And this was the kind of perspective that he had on that Frutiger typeface. And this is the story of typography, of how we human beings got to a point today where all of us, whenever we send an email, when we create a web page, when we put a button on one of our web applications, there's a font. And those fonts send a message about who we think we are and how we would like the world to perceive us. So how did we get here? Well, we started out here, about 5,000 years ago, ancient Mesopotamia, the river valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is now Iraq. And this is a really interesting point in human history, because this is the first time ever that we had first world problems. Because what has happened here? This is an incredibly fertile valley. The farmland there is really good. And so for the first time in history, people start growing crops. They stop moving, they stop hunting and gathering and foraging, and they start actually cultivating land. They start growing food. And for the first time in history, we have humans who have more food than they need. Now, this never happened before. And the priests in the temples look at this and go, oh, that's a nice pile of food you've got there. Why don't you give it to us? And we'll keep it safe for you in the temple. And then when the winter comes round, if you don't have any food, you come to us and we'll give you some food. And of course, this meant that the priests had loads of food and they never needed to worry about anything. But very rapidly after this system was adopted, it was decided that it would be a good idea if they could keep track of who had given how much food to the temples to look after. And so people started making marks in clay tablets to record how many cows, how many sheep, how many bushels of grain, by who and when had been logged in these temples. Now, there is a huge amount going on here. Human beings have had spoken language for probably tens of thousands of years by this point. We don't know exactly. But language is developed. People already have concepts like debt and credit and loans and something being due 5 days from now. Things that are difficult to make marks to communicate on the surface of a piece of clay. So we're going to play a little game now. This is a real easy game. We're going to get some audience participation going. What I'm going to do, I'm going to show you a picture. I'm going to count 3, 2, 1, and when I get to 0, I want you all to shout out the name of the country that's in that picture, okay? I'm going to start out with a nice, easy one. You ready? 3, 2, 1. Australia. Very good, Australia. Let's take a look at another one. 3, 2, 1. Sweden. Excellent. 3, 2, 1. Paris, not a country. But at least not yet. But no, I mean, you got it. You got the meaning. That communicated the correct. You were thinking in the right place, just not thinking quite wide enough. This one, 3, 2, 1. Very good. This one. 3, 2, 1. Yeah, I realize it's bold putting that in a Portuguese conference, but here we go. How about this one? 3, 2, 1. Thailand is the correct answer. 3, 2, 1. One more. 3, 2, 1. Canada. Excellent. We got some people read Japanese. Ka-na-da in Japanese. Now, these are pictograms. And pictograms are when you communicate an idea by literally making a picture of the thing you want to talk about. If the aliens arrive from Alpha Centauri, there's this lovely quote from Bill Bryson. If you were giving aliens directions of where to meet in planet Earth, you tell them to find the big, round, flat thing with the hole in the top and meet at the bump in the middle. And they're all going to land at Uluru in the middle of Australia. If you look at Australia from space, it's that shape. You recognize it. If you have been to Paris or you've seen pictures of Paris, you recognize the Eiffel Tower. It's very visually distinctive. Now, a lot of modern pictographic language comes from the Tokyo Olympic Games, 1964, because this was the first time Japan had hosted a really high-profile international event. And most of the people, the athletes, the journalists, the spectators who were coming to Japan for the games, they could not read or speak or understand Japanese. They couldn't even make sense of the alphabet. And so the organizers of the games designed a set of symbols to help people navigate around. This, if you're hungry, knife and fork. If you want to get something to drink, there's a cup of tea. If you're looking for the showers in the Olympic athletes' village, you follow the pictorial sign for the shower there. Now, this idea of pictographic writing, this goes all the way back to ancient Babylon when the scribes would make marks in a piece of clay by literally drawing a picture of a cow's head to depict the fact that there was a cow had been lodged with the temple and the priests owe you one cow. And as this became more and more popular, they kind of stopped drawing all the details and the cow turned into this. And then at some point, it got rotated 90 degrees. There's a theory this is because when you're writing in wet clay, you want to turn the tablet so that you don't get it smudged on things. But this ended up being rotated a little bit, and trade started to spread, and we got to a point where there were people who recognized this sign as meaning a cow who had never seen the original. They're just like, oh yeah, the sideways with the line through it, that means one cow has been lodged with the temple, and the pictorial connection had been lost. Now, at this point, we've progressed from pictograms to ideograms. It's not a picture of a cow anymore, but this picture stands for the idea of a cow. If you've seen this picture, we've all seen this picture. This picture is in every online collaboration and video chat application. This is the chat icon. It's the thing you click when you want to talk to someone. Now, nobody has ever seen a chat bubble in real life. I don't have a little thing above my head right now with words appearing in it. Maybe when we all buy our Apple VR headsets, that's going to be a thing. It's not there yet. Nobody's ever seen this. It's not a pictogram, but we all understand it. Because comic books is a kind of culturally universal convention of having speech appear written in these kinds of bubbles. Now, I love the fact that this visual language is still evolving. There is a symbol that within my career as a software developer has gone from being a pictogram to being an ideogram, and it's this. Because when I first started using Word 97, that was a picture of the disk that you saved your work on. And now, that symbol has survived. That's still in the toolbar. There are people out there who have never seen a physical floppy disk, but they know that click that button means save your work. And there is a lovely and possibly apocryphal story about a little girl who found a stack of floppy disks in her mum's desk drawer and comes downstairs going, "Mummy, why have you printed the save button?" Now, the thing about ideograms is that they are to do with context. You need to know what they mean, but also, this goes back to what Eli was talking about in their keynote yesterday. You need to be sure that the person on the other side also knows what they mean. Now, I'm in 43 different Slacks right now, because I'm in Slacks for conferences and clients I consult with, and I'm in a bunch of different chats and things. And I can put a question in one of these Slacks that, hey, it looks like the media CDN's gone down, there's no images are loading, anyone know what's up with it? And someone replies with eyes. Now, I've been in teams where eyes means, I am looking into this for you right now, give me a few minutes. I've also been in teams where eyes mean, I'm watching this, because I also want to know what's happened. It's like sitting back there eating popcorn, yeah, I can't wait to see what's going on. Now, those are diametrically opposite meanings in terms of what do I do next? Do I wait and let them deal with it, or do I try and find someone who can help with the problem? Now, Slack officially says that eyes means let others know. Have you ever seen this documentation before? Yeah, this is apparently officially what these mean, but that meaning has not gone around. And if I send my girlfriend a photograph of me and a bunch of you later in a bar doing Jägermeister shots, I will get back eyes, and it will not mean I am looking into this for you now. It will be, oh, what have you done? Now, one ideogram or one kind of ideographic thing that came out of the Tokyo Olympics, first time this had been used, 1964, was this symbol, which people very rapidly figured out means something very important that you do not want to draw an accurate picture of. It might get the meaning across, but let's not even go there. But these symbols have meaning because we've learned them. We know that that means the bathrooms. We know that means Norway. That means Spain. That means the Olympics. It has to be drummed into us. We have to learn this. Back in ancient Mesopotamia, the trade routes are spreading. Ships are sailing from the Babylonian coast. They're getting as far as Greece, North Africa, Rome, bits of what is now Italy. And this cow has been turned another 90 degrees. That one has gone missing. And people have stopped using it to stand for cow. Instead, they are recognizing this as the first sound in the Hebrew word aleph, which means a cow, it means cattle. And so this shape doesn't mean cow anymore, it means the sound ah. And then there is another symbol in here, or another word in Hebrew. Start out as this, Beth, it's a house. Bethlehem in the Bible, the nativity story, Bethlehem, literally the house of bread in Hebrew. And this symbol got simplified to this, and somewhere along the line that one got rotated as well. And then the ancient Greeks got hold of Aleph and Beth, and when that doesn't sound Greek, Alpha and Beta, that sounds Greek, and this is how we got the alphabet. But this was a paradigm shift in how useful written language was as a way of communicating, because suddenly we had a way of writing down sounds. We had what are called phonograms, where the symbols represent noises. So any word we know how to say, in theory, we know how to write it. If you have ever tried to read written Danish, you know that this is still not actually true, but it's a good theory. Now, at this point, we're going to fast forward a little bit. We're going to jump forward to around about the 1st century of the Common Era, 1st century AD. And there's a bunch more stuff we want to invent here. Now, the earliest writing system, something that I find quite amazing, is that in about the year 100 AD, we had paper and we had books. And we didn't have paper books for another 1,000 years. Because paper was invented in China in the 1st century, but in China they didn't print books. The technical term for a book is a codex, pages with 2 kind of hard covers around it. So in China they had paper scrolls for about a millennium, and in Europe we had codexes printed on vellum, which is parchment, it's leather parchment. And so it took about 1,000 years before these ideas were sort of mashed together. Now, the invention of mechanical printing is a really big deal in the history of communication and typography. For a long while there, if you wanted to make a book, what you had to do is find another book that had the book you wanted in it and take it probably to some monks and say, can you copy this for me? And they would. Copying, say, the Christian Bible took about 2 or 3 years. Books were incredibly rare. They were incredibly expensive. Most people couldn't read. Most people couldn't write. And so the scarcity was self-sustaining. People weren't literate, therefore there was no market, so there was no incentive to drive down costs to streamline production. Now, the invention that is generally credited as changing all that was a thing called the movable type printing press. Now, the history that you learn in Europe says that movable type was invented by Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany, one afternoon in about 1546. Kind of not. Like, he took a bunch of things that already existed. Kind of like how Steve Jobs didn't invent the iPhone. What he did is he had a bunch of people who took technology that was already being developed in the society around him and, yeah, came up with a brilliant new way of synthesizing all of this technology into a new kind of device. Gutenberg invented the printing press by combining some ideas that had already been kind of ratified in medieval China. He took a bunch of ideas like using a press that was used to press grapes to make wine, and he combined them into something that would revolutionize printing. Now, to understand why, the inventor of movable type, why is this a big deal? Well, to do that, we need to understand what is type and why was making it movable exciting. There are not enough words for all the stuff that we do. If the type of type equals type, you type your program here. This is a perfectly valid piece of English, but the word type is massively overloaded. We talk about strongly typed languages, weakly typed language. So strongly typed, if you don't know, is when you push the keys really hard. That's strongly typed. And weakly typed is when you like doing this. And, we talk about typists and typing and data types and record types and all these kinds of things. But the word type, all these derivations come via printing from an ancient Greek word tuptein, which means to punch something, to strike something. And a piece of type looks like this. This is a single letter of a single alphabet that has been painstakingly carved in metal. And the first kind of origins of this is a guy called Bisheng. And Bisheng's around the year 1040 AD. Bisheng created the first industrial printing movable type system in China. History has basically forgotten this guy, certainly in the West, but there is a crater named after him on the moon, which I think is pretty cool. And his system used ceramic. The type pieces were made out of cast porcelain, and it used a combination of wax and ash as a printer ink. It worked up to a point, but the porcelain type pieces would wear out. So any piece you made, you'd get a couple of scrolls out of it, then you'd need to make another one. Johannes Gutenberg's big idea was to make the punches out of steel. So you'd start off with the punch. This is the one on the left. Now these things, once you got one of those, you hit this thing with it. This is literally a stereotype. This is where that word comes from, is you punch that and it creates the counterpart. It creates the other side of the pair. And then you use the stereotype to churn out loads of these. These are cast in a thing called printer's lead. It's a soft metal with a low melting point. You churn out a whole bunch of these, and then you arrange them in a matrix. You clamp the matrix shut, you smear it with ink, and bang, you get a page. Gutenberg is kind of remembered for producing a thing called the Gutenberg Bible. This was, one of the first books ever to be mass printed using his techniques there. Now, he printed around about 200 Bibles. There were, we think, 200 Gutenberg Bibles, fewer than 200 were ever printed, over the course of about 5 years. Jump forward 5 centuries, from 1450 to 1950, within the United States alone, there are more than 50 million newspapers being printed and distributed every morning. And they are doing it using the same technique as Gutenberg's movable type press. They're just doing it on a scale that we couldn't imagine. Now, the kind of heyday, the peak of print journalism and mechanically printed media was all done thanks to this machine. It's a thing called a linotype. If you ever get the chance to see a linotype machine working, I promise you it will be one of the coolest things that you have ever seen. They have one, this is in Amberley, which is about an hour south of London in England. And I went down there a couple of months ago and I took some photos of their machine and stuff. Now, this thing it's just unbelievable. It has a crucible of molten lead hanging on the side of it. It has a keyboard, it has a handbrake, it has all of these incredibly precisely machined parts. And the key to it all is this thing here. It's a linotype matrix. And if you look closely, you can see the letter stereotypes on this thing. And you can see this little grooved pattern at the top. Looks kind of like your front door key for your house. The key there at the top, that is a 7-bit binary encoding machined into hardware. Now, there is a wonderful visualization. Sylvia Itzigel created this for a museum in Hamburg. And this is how the linotype machine works. You've got your keyboard across the bottom here. So you punch a bunch of keys on the keyboard, and every key you punch, one of those matrices drops down out of this magazine, down one of these little things. One of these things gets jammed or stuck. It's never going to let you down. And then the cartridges are moved across here into what's called the mouthpiece. This thing is then opened up to the crucible full of molten lead, and molten metal is squirted through the mouthpiece into that matrix. It takes a couple of seconds, it cools down, and what you get is a printed slug of molten metal. You take a bunch of those, rack them up, that's your column of newsprint, ready to go off and be printed. But then what happens is every one of those matrices is returned up to the top of the machine. There's a thing called the collector. Cranks them up to the top and threads them onto this bar. And the bar at the top here, this thing is the distributor. And the distributor has that binary code encoded into it as a set of gaps. So every letter drops into exactly the right place in the magazine. Now this magazine here weighs about 60 or 70 kilos. So if you want to change fonts, this isn't a drop-down list. You've got to get a friend to help you carry the magazine and get another magazine out and bring it back. And at the end of the process, one of the things that they have down in the Print Museum in Amberley, this is the linotype matrices from the last edition of the Sunday Express newspaper to be printed in England using this technique. You'd print this, you'd take an impression of that, and you'd use the impression to make a single cast on a revolving steel drum, and that's the thing you see in the movies when it's the presses and the newspapers are rolling. That is the press, and that's the thing that does the rolling. Now, these linotype machines, they are fantastic. They are masterpieces of engineering. Thomas Edison once said that the linotype combines the power of a locomotive with the precision of a wristwatch. And he wasn't wrong, you know, they're astonishing things. About 1970, there were over 100,000 of these machines in use around the world. At the moment, I don't think there is a single operational one in Europe. I know about 4 of them, and they're all broken right now because the guy who fixes them hasn't gone back out on the road after the pandemic. There's one in Berlin in Germany, there's one in Hamburg, there's one in Amberley, there's one in the Science Museum in London. Right now, none of them's working. There's a guy in the US who restores them, but we're talking fewer than 1,000 of these machines survive. So what happened that took us from 100,000 linotype machines to fewer than 1,000? Now, the Linotype Corporation, that survives today. The machines, no one needs the machines. No one needs the lead, no one needs the slugs, the matrices. But Linotype owned something else. Linotype owned the fonts. And as we're going to see in the second half of the talk, it turns out that even when you take all of the wonderful mechanical engineering out of the equation, the fonts are still a pretty big deal. Now, when we talk about fonts and typefaces, what we are talking about, we saw at the beginning, is a whole bunch of decisions about how you are going to draw the letters of your alphabet. You take a vertical bar like this, well, is it going to be just like a rectangle like this one? Maybe we're going to round off the corners. Maybe we want this to be kind of a little bit oblique, a little bit like it looks like it was done with a pen. Maybe we're going to draw a crossbar across the top of it. We're going to turn this into something like a capital letter T. So we stick that. Are they going to be the same size? The same height, the same width? How tall is our letter going to be? This sends a message. It creates an illusion in people's heads. Are we going to go with fine type? Are we going to go with heavy type? Are we going to go with fine type in one direction, heavy in another direction? Maybe we're going to hang little frilly bits off the corners here. Maybe we're going to round the chamfers on those frilly bits. Maybe we're going to combine them, and we're going to have block serifs is the technical term for this kind of thing. All of those decisions just to draw a capital letter T. We're going to draw a Y. What does the tail look like? Is it got a little hook in it? Is it going to be shaped like a bucket or like a bowl? Is the letter O going to be a circle? Or maybe it's going to be a rounded square. Or maybe we're going to make the letter O into a thing, but we're going to make the hole in the middle a slightly different shape. We're going to make that oval. We're going to stretch it. We're going to slant it. We're going to make all of these decisions that affect the way people perceive the type. We're going to establish some conventions. We've got an O, okay, so the O is going to get reused in the P. We've got a letter E. How tall is it going to be? Where is this crossbar going to go? Is it going to be at an angle? Maybe we go all the way and we make this look like it was drawn by hand. We make it look like a handwriting font. Now, most of the typefaces that companies like Linotype originated were designed by hand. This is the original hand-drawn design for what I think is one of the most beautiful and enduring typefaces in history. Does anyone recognize this from anywhere? It's the London Underground. It's called Johnston, and it was designed for the London Underground Transportation Network. Johnston is distinctive because letters like the C and the Q, they are perfect circles. That's how you can spot Johnston. It uses circles. And this was hand-drawn by Edward Johnston and then handed over to the machinists who would make the types, the type punches, for producing this in all the different fonts and weights and sizes, and then that would be used to do the printing. Now, while all this stuff is going on, a revolution is happening somewhere else behind the scenes. Now, the earliest computer systems, typography wasn't really something they were concerned with because they didn't have the capability to do very much. The earliest computers, this is the earliest computer I could find that had a screen, but the screen on this is, I think, a PDP-1. The screen on this was basically an oscilloscope, and for anything important, you used the typewriter. Now we're going to take a little diversion here into the incredibly misogynistic world of electronics in the 1970s, because this is Radio Electronics, the magazine for men with ideas in electronics, from 1973. And this had an article by a guy called Don Lancaster about how to build a television typewriter. Now, a TV typewriter is a particularly useless piece of technology, because you push a key and it puts a letter on a screen. You can't edit it, you can't save it, you can't print it, you can't email it. All it does is it puts the letter on the screen, so you can see what keys you pressed, and then you switch it off. And thank you for playing television typewriter. But a lot of the ideas and the techniques and the circuits that were pioneered on these kinds of projects would end up driving the first wave of bitmap character displays used on personal computers. Now, the period we're talking about, ASCII has been a standard for about a decade. ASCII is kind of 1965. So by the mid-1970s, we knew ASCII, we had that. That was international and established as a good idea. We had ASCII tables. So what actually happened when you were on your mini computer in the 1970s, you press the letter A. And what happens, that sends the ASCII code 65 into your machine's firmware, and then it uses 65 to look it up in a thing called a character generator, which is just a big dictionary of numbers. And it says, well, 65 maps onto this. Anyone know what that number is in binary? It looks like that. And the number doesn't matter, because what that number is a bit map. We take that number, we cut it up, we shuffle it around, and then we say, right, the ones are solid and the zeros are blanks. And that is literally how the letter A gets drawn on your screen on ROM-based character mapping systems. And if you go online, you get into the terminal emulation stuff. Like you get the open source VT220 terminal emulators. People have reverse engineered these chips to get exactly the right bitmap fonts out so that they can make them look as authentic as possible. Now, while all this bitmap font stuff is going on, there is a guy called Donald Knuth who is producing his great masterwork, The Art of Computer Programming. Now, you know the thing when you're doing a piece of work and then you kind of get distracted and you go down a rabbit hole and you're like, I don't like my email. I'm going to see if I can change the color on my email program, and you spend 10 minutes goofing off. Knuth was halfway through writing volume 1 of his book, and he went, I don't like the fonts. And he took a 10-year break down the rabbit hole to invent the first computerized typesetting system, which is called TeX. Now, TeX produced wonderful, high-quality output, but you didn't know what it was going to look like. You took your TeX source code, which looked like this. Any of you folks written in TeX or worked with it? I think, hands down if that wasn't just for that one paper at university that you had to do in TeX. Yeah. I did like one semester of TeX, and then I was like, Word is a good idea. I like this. Because TeX's big problem is this is what you saw, and this is what you got, and you didn't get that until you'd sent your TeX files to an industrial typesetter who would charge you a lot of money and send you back a manuscript, and you'd be like, oh, I made a spelling mistake. That's going to cost me $1,000. Now, we had these two worlds. We had bitmap fonts, and we had this kind of typesetting. And when you look back over the history of technology, there are two things that I find astonishing. One is the sheer number of things that we right now, we just take for granted, that when they first came out, they were mind-blowing. They were unbelievable. Nobody had seen anything like this ever before. And if you make a list, or if I make a list of all the things that I think are astonishing according to this definition, a surprising number of them all originated from the same company. And this is where we find out if the audio is going to work.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives we have created. all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory thoughts. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
That's a computer commercial, directed by Ridley Scott, that was shown at the Super Bowl halftime in 1983. Probably the most expensive commercial television slot you can get anywhere in the world. Apple did not do things by halves. Now, the Apple Macintosh had a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't like anything anyone had seen before, including a visual display, it had bitmap displays, it had a mouse, it had windows, and it had fonts. And Apple did not want to pay the Linotype Corporation for their fonts, so they hired this lady, Susan Kerr, to design the typefaces that shipped with the Macintosh. Now, some of those were kind of an obvious tribute. There was one called New York, which was like a Times, because New York Times, and there was one called Swiss, which was obviously based on Helvetica, and some of them were original. There was a font called Chicago, it was the system font on the original Apple Macintosh, and then Chicago got a renaissance about 20 years later because it was the default font when Apple first launched the iPod. Now, the most powerful computer that you could buy from Apple in 1984 was not actually a computer. It was a printer. The thing on the left here, the Macintosh, this thing has an 8 megahertz processor. This thing has a 12 megahertz processor. This thing has a 512K of RAM. The thing on the left was, I think, upgradable to 2 megabytes. The laser writer cost something like $8,000 for the printer, but this was because it could do something no one had ever done before. The Macintosh supported a system called PostScript. PostScript was a page description language for rendering high-quality renditions of documents. The final missing piece of the puzzle. You had your desktop display, you had your Apple laser writer, and you had PageMaker. You had the first desktop publishing application, which meant for the first time in history, you could lay out a page on your screen that looked like it was going to, in kind of clunky bitmap fonts. You could print it and get a high-quality proof. You could be like, that is going to look good. And then you could send that file to an industrial typesetting bureau, and they would go and run you off 10,000 copies of this. Now, the problem with bitmap fonts, those character generator ROM fonts, they look fantastic at small sizes, but if you make them bigger, they look like crap. They just do not look terribly good. Now, the thing that PostScript did, all of those fonts with the Macintosh, they shipped in 2 versions. There was a bitmap version, and there was a vector version. Now, a vector typeface is not a map of bits. It is a set of equations describing the shape of those letters. Let's say that we want to draw a dot, and we want to draw just a solid, like a full stop, nice big chunky full stop, and we're going to say that this full stop here, that's the size of thing that we want to draw here, and we're going to work in inches because we're printing here, and even in the most metric countries in the world, print still works in inches and dots per inch and these kinds of things. So we're going to say the center of our circle is 4 inches by 4 inches, and we've got a 1/2 inch radius. So for every point in that circle, we are going to say if px minus 4 minus p is greater than this. So we got floating point squared arithmetic going on here. And if it's inside the circle, we paint it. Otherwise, we don't. And so we fill that in. Now, the Apple laser writer had a resolution of 144 dots per inch, which meant to draw a 1-inch circle, 20,736 dots. We're talking probably 6 floating point operations. So we're talking about something like 100,000 floating point instructions to draw 1 full stop. That's why the laser writer had to have this incredibly powerful processing unit inside it. And that's just to draw dots. We want to draw the letter O. Well, now you've got to work out what's inside the circle but outside the ellipse. We want to draw a letter B, for example. Well, we've got all the dots that are inside the circle or the square or the square or the square or the rectangle but aren't inside any of these things, so we can knock the chamfers off and we fill in that bit and we take the lines out. Now, this looks beautiful. You can create these incredibly, wonderfully elegant, crisp things in there. And the technology which enabled all of this was PostScript. Now, PostScript was created by Adobe. They wrote the engine that drove the LaserWriter printer, and PostScript was licensed. PostScript cost about $100. If you wanted to put PostScript in your device, you had to get Adobe $100. And this was fine when you were selling printers for $8,000. It was no problem giving Adobe 100 of that. But computers got faster, chips got cheaper, the convergence was obvious. At some point, like by the end of the 80s, we could kind of all see that we were going to eventually get away from bitmap fonts and vector fonts, and it was all going to be unified. And Apple and Microsoft got together and went, do you want to give Adobe money? And Microsoft went, no. And Apple went, we don't either. You want to do a thing? And Microsoft went, yeah, all right. You see, the problem with those TrueType, with these vector fonts, is when you draw them on bitmap displays. So here we go. This is our display grid. These are our pixels. We want to draw a letter B, kind of small, so we can put it in a menu bar, right? Let's fill in all the squares which are completely within the outline. Yeah. It's not going to work, is it? Okay, so let's, what if we fill in any square that's like more than 50% within the outline? And now, I mean, we can tell it's a B, but it still doesn't look terribly good. So maybe we say, well, if it's completely within, we're going to shade it 100% black, and if it's 50%, then we'll shade it 50% black. And it's starting to look a little better, but it's kind of blurry, and it's not terribly nice to look at. The big thing that Microsoft and Apple, they put their heads together and they came up with a way of describing fonts that included something called hinting. And hinting basically says, look, if you've got to draw this font on a laser printer, yeah, do the maths, knock yourself out. If you've got to draw it on a screen, 640 by 480 VGA 1990 style, here are the pixels that you are going to color in. This is exactly what you draw. This technology is called hinting. It is apparently one of the most infuriatingly complex things it is possible to do in IT. Hinting typefaces by hand is some serious magic. Now, this did not ship in Windows 3.0, but it did ship in Windows 3.1. And because I'm a sucker for old computers, I got Windows 3.1 running on a VM so I could make slides for this talk. And there it is. And if you go into the control panel on your Windows 3.1 and you go into fonts, and you can see we got this little message at the bottom there. It says, this is a scalable TrueType font that can be displayed on screen and printed on your printer. And it seems bizarre now to think that we used to have fonts that you could see but you couldn't print. But this was the state of the art until I was already building web pages for money, you know? And if you zoom in and you look real close, you can see the hinting. You can see the individual pixels that are being colored in by this hinting technology. Now, Windows 3.1 kind of rolled around. The next significant innovation that came out of digital typography came out of one of the most unlikely projects in history, Microsoft Bob. Now, in 1994, Microsoft have got one team working on the next version of Windows, Windows 95. They have another team who are like, maybe people don't want a computer that looks like a computer. Maybe people want a computer that looks like a living room with a dog who talks to you and helps you do your job. And maybe people, if they want to make an appointment, they click on the wall calendar. And maybe if they want to look at their recipe database, they click on the door to the kitchen. And maybe if they're stuck, they click on the dog and they ask it questions. And this guy called Vincent Conair was a type designer working at Microsoft, and he saw a prototype of Bob. And he went, why is the dog using Times New Roman? That's not a very cartoon dog kind of a font. And so he created a sans serif typeface from Microsoft MS that was designed to look like a comic book. Comic Sans MS. Now, Microsoft Bob was taken out the back and shot. It was Steve Ballmer went on record as saying, it's a great example of us realizing we'd made a horrible mistake and killing it before it got out, as opposed to SharePoint, which is a horrible mistake that we are still living with today. Comic Sans MS, however, it escaped. It shipped with the Windows 95 Plus pack, and then it shipped with Office 97. Now, Comic Sans is a perfectly good typeface. It is clear, it is readable, It is friendly. The problem is the people using it. Because Comic Sans sends a, hey, come to my daughter's 5th birthday party. There's going to be cake and a clown. What Comic Sans does not say is, here is how much money it cost to bury your husband. But there it is. I have seen Comic Sans used in some of the most unbelievably inappropriate scenarios. And what it sends to me is a message that says, hey, we buried your husband, but yay! Now, the next big innovation on the road to digital typography nirvana happened because we went from these to these. Flat screen displays. Cathode ray tubes were kind of the state of the art for a long, long while. And so I went, hang on, we could take like the digital watches and we could make them bigger and in color, and we can make them thin, and we can use those on our computers. And this unlocked the path to a whole new technique for rendering typefaces. Now, if you go to Google's homepage and you take a screenshot and you zoom way in, you'll notice you get weird colored fringing on the letters. And if you look closely, you'll see that the bit on the west is always kind of orangey, and the bit on the east is always kind of greeny blue, right? If, however, you don't zoom in on a screenshot, what this is doing, this is magnifying the data that Windows is sending to my display. This is not the only way to make things bigger. You can take an SLR camera, put a macro lens on it, and take a photograph of your screen. And if you zoom in on the word typography with an optical zoom, what you see is this. You see the individual red, green, and blue components that make up each of those square pixels on your screen. And what somebody realized is that by exploiting the fact that we've got red, green, blue, red, green, blue, red, green, blue, effectively we have 3 times as much horizontal resolution to play with as it looked like we did. So if you take your letter B and you draw it like this, what you're actually doing is you are subdividing this grid and you're only filling in specific bits of it. And so you are effectively tripling the horizontal resolution that you can use when you're rendering your typefaces. And so you get this kind of before and after effect. Now, this was called ClearType. Microsoft announced this at Comdex in 1998. Lots of fanfare. This is amazing, looks fantastic. This is still used today. ClearType is a kind of standard across all sorts of devices. And they held a patent on it. Microsoft patented this in 1998. But it wasn't invented by Microsoft, and it wasn't invented in 1998. It was invented in 1977 by Steve Wozniak to get high-resolution text on the Apple II. And Microsoft know this because the Microsoft Basic Reference Manual from 1982 for Apple, Microsoft Basic on Apple, explicitly calls out that you can use subpixel font rendering. Now, I don't know if this was a completely honest mistake. A company the size of Microsoft, you can easily see how they would be unaware that they had actually found this and then forgotten it, and then someone rediscovered it again. But yeah, if anyone ever wants to challenge the Microsoft patent, you can use their own publication as prior art to prove they knew about this and they knew that someone else did it. Now, while we're talking about the Apple II, I just want to give a shout out to one of my favorite things that I stumbled across researching this talk. This guy called Michael Koss created this, which is the smallest pixel font I think it is possible to create. Every character is drawn on a 5x3 matrix. So this meant that you could get 80 columns and 25 rows on an Apple II on a home television set in the late 1970s. And it also means that each one of these characters is less than 16 bits of information. And so the entire typeface fits into 256 bytes of memory, which is pretty astonishing. No one gives a crap about that now, because first of all, the 90s came around, and we went, yay, storage is cheap. Look, CD-ROMs, 650 megabytes. You know what? They're so cheap, we're going to give you your program on one disk, and we're going to put another disk in, which is just full of fonts, because we got to put something on there. And I remember as a teenager going through the CorelDRAW disk tool and being like, so many fonts. I want to use all of them in my homework. And apparently that's not a good idea, and it doesn't look very nice. I never used Comic Sans, though, and I'm proud of that fact. So we had this kind of renaissance in the mid-90s where suddenly everything was on CD-ROM and there was almost no limit on how much data you could shovel into things. And then everything changed almost overnight because the World Wide Web happened. The dot-com boom happened. The future was under construction. And you remember the Internet Connection Wizard? Anyone? I mean, there's people who've never seen this. Now, this is around the time I started doing web development professionally. The late sort of 97, 98, I started building websites for clients for money. And most of these companies, maybe they had a CD-ROM catalog. They definitely had a printed catalog that they had hired designers. They had colors, they had fonts, they had layouts. And they all had the same thing. We want our website to look like our brochure. And we were like, yeah, we know, but it's 1997 and websites look like this in 1997 because you were limited to the fonts that the browser knew how to do. Nobody was going to download a font over dial-up internet just to look at your company's website the way that you wanted it to look. Now, we could give it our best shot. One of the web technologies that emerged very early on, the first version of CSS, was the idea of fallback fonts. And we could say, all right, well, look, if by any chance the person looking at your website, now, this was normally an employee at the client, so this was good. So when the people who paid your invoices looked at it, it looked really nice because they had their font installed. They had no idea that all their customers were seeing it in something different. Use Futura semi-bold if it's available, and if it's not, look for Helvetica. And if you can't find Helvetica, use Arial, and if you can't find Arial, use sans serif. Any sans serif will do. We don't care. We are not fussy. Now, there aren't a whole lot of takeaways in this talk, but I am going to leave you with or rather share with you, a technique that you can use to create great mischief among your colleagues. You need somebody you don't like who runs Microsoft Windows, and you need an open source application called FontForge, which is for designing and creating and publishing and converting font files. And what we are going to do is we are going to go to dafont.com and we are going to find something way out there. We're going to look around this. We're going to pick something on here like Abstract Groovy. And Abstract Groovy is a wonderful kind of 70s disco typeface that is apparently completely 100% free, so hopefully no one's going to sue us for doing this. So we're going to download Abstract Groovy, and then we are going to open it up in FontForge, and we are going to go into Element Info, and we're just going to tweak this a little bit. I'm going to change the font name from Abstract Groovy to Helvetica Neue. And we're going to change the family name to Helvetica Neue. Helvetica Neue is an incredibly cool typeface that hipsters love because it's the one that shipped with the first Retina displays on iPad and iPhone. And so a whole bunch of people are like, we want our product to look like Apple product. We're going to use Helvetica Neue. Helvetica Neue does not come with Microsoft Windows. So we are now going to export our font file, and we are going to send it to our friend and go, hey, check out this awesome disco font. And they are probably going to go, oh yeah, that's brilliant. I want that on my computer. And they're going to click install. They are not going to notice font name Helvetica Neue hiding up there in the corner. They're not going to notice anything, not for a couple of days, maybe a week. And then they are going to go onto a website that uses Helvetica Neue, and it's going to come up in Abstract Groovy. Or they are going to get an invoice from the iTunes store. And they're going to be like, Apple are getting hard into this Groovy thing. Or, they are going to try and log into their business accounting software. Now, I actually discovered this technique entirely by mistake. I was doing a web job for a client who sent me their house fonts, and I didn't notice that in this zip file of fonts, there was an incredibly bad version of Helvetica. I didn't notice it, didn't notice anything for a couple of days, and then I just noticed the web looked crap. Like, I just kept going on these websites and being, why are all the letters kind of blurry and they got weird artifacting and everything? And eventually I figured out this was all the websites that were rendering Helvetica, and if you can't find it, fall back to Arial. And so up to that point, Microsoft Windows, Arial. I'd never had a Helvetica font on there. I installed this one, it messed everything up. So yeah, prank your colleagues. I'll leave it as an exercise for the reader to work out how to undo this. It's harder than you think. Or maybe you just stick with it. Turns out that the web is a much friendlier place when everything is rendered in Abstract Groovy. Now, There has always been this tension at the heart of web typography and web design, because on the one hand, we have the craft, the profession of type design. This goes back to Gutenberg. We have centuries of experience. People literally, these are textbooks on how to study the history of graphic design. You can buy a book about how to learn about the stuff that you want to learn about. And on the other hand, we have developers who are like, lol. Now, the type people, they know how to do information layout. They know how to use fonts. They know how to use everything. They were not prepared for us turning up and saying, yeah, we need you to design something. By the way, we don't know how wide it's going to be. We don't know how tall it's going to be. We don't know how big it's going to be. And now, as you saw in my talk yesterday with dark mode email, we can't even tell you what background color your work is going to go on. On the other hand, the developers, we don't know anything about type design. We're like, just put all the buttons on the screen. The user will figure it out eventually. Now, CSS has been doing wonderful, valiant work to try and bridge this gap. And within the last 5 years, we've started seeing, a body of web design by designers who had never lived in a world where print first happened. Print happened first. We're seeing the first kind of digital native designers, and a lot of these things are starting to go away. And of course, CSS is a big, contribution to why this is working. Now, one of the big deals with CSS was a thing called web fonts, web open font format. This came out at about 2009, and for the first time, you could put a font on your website and say, hey, this website should look like this. Here's the font we want you to use on it. Now, this opened up a whole new toolbox of things that we could do with it, because up until this point, using specialist fonts for specialist characters, it had been done from time to time. Has any of you ever received an email that just weirdly ends with the letter J, just on its own at the end of a sentence? And you're like, where did the J come from? Now, before the advent of web fonts, Microsoft Windows, before the advent of Unicode, Microsoft Windows shipped with a font called Wingdings. And Wingdings was basically, it took the letters of the alphabet, A to Z, 0 to 9, and it said, well, let's make them look like printers' dingbats. Stars, playing card shapes, bullet points, all these kinds of things. Now, in the 90s, so A would map onto this thing here, 2 would map onto this thing, so you press W, you get one of these diamonds. Now, what happened at some point in the 90s is some guy a computer consultant working in New York, he noticed that if you were using Wingdings and you typed NYC, you got this. And so he immediately got on the phone to the New York Post. And he said, I've uncovered a secret conspiracy at Microsoft that says it's okay to kill Jews in New York. And the New York Post, being famously responsible journalists, went, don't be ridiculous. No, of course they didn't. They ran it on the front page as uncovering secret Microsoft font conspiracy. Now, Microsoft are like, just shut up. This is just a total coincidence. Honestly, you people can find stuff anywhere. But somebody remembered, because 5 years later, when Microsoft brought out a font called Webdings, if you type NYC in Webdings, you get I love New York, which I thought was rather nice. Now, the reason for the J is if you end your email with a smiley face on Microsoft Outlook, Outlook goes, oh, smiley face, I know how to do that one. I can change the font to Wingdings and put the little smiley face in. But then if the person who receives your email doesn't have Wingdings, they get J. The reason I remember this is that I used to work for somebody called Jay in a company that used Microsoft Outlook for email. And so this is a real example of, what is the difference in tone between these two based on whether it ends with a smiley face or not. But it turns out that being able to choose the font that you want to use for a single character is actually fantastically useful, because on the web, it means that we can include in our website things like Font Awesome. We can go, here is a library of wonderful, crisp, high-definition images for icons and playback buttons and infographics, and even R2-D2 is lurking in here somewhere. We can plug in this font file. We can say, render this using that font. And the beautiful thing about it is all of that wonderful mathematical crispness that we saw with the Apple LaserWriter and PostScript, that's all in here. So as devices get better and better and sharper, we can just scale up the fonts and get these beautifully smooth things. And that's a big deal, because hardware is doing some amazing things. 12 years ago, if you told me that I was going to read a novel on a computer screen, I would have said, no, I'm not. Why would anybody do that? And then Kindle came along. The first time I saw Kindle in a shop, I literally, I saw this thing and I was like, that's obviously a fake one that they have on display so people don't break it. And then the store assistant pushed the button and the screen changed. I was like, yes, I'll take it. I don't care how much it is. I want this now. And, Kindle has revolutionized the way I read because I travel a lot, so I can take 500 books with me on something that fits in my pocket. And the way that Kindle and these devices work is actually really cool. They only use power when you turn the page. Inside each of those little cells in the Kindle screen, there are charged black and white pigment particles, and all it does when you turn the page is it calculates a new matrix and it flips the electrical field, which means the black floats to the top or vice versa, but then it switches off. And so it doesn't use power when it's just showing you a page, which is how the Kindle can run for like a month between recharges. Now, a couple of years ago, I switched from Kindle to using one of these. This is an Android tablet with an e-ink display, which means it's a Kindle I can do crossword puzzles on, and I can scribble on, and I can take notes on. And I just found out last year the company Onyx that makes these things, by the way, if you want to see a real one of these, come and chat to me. I've got it in my bag here. They have brought out color e-ink. Now, you're not going to sit and watch movies on this thing, but you have something that is akin to sort of the watercolor palette now. It's not bright, rich colors, but it's good enough for reading comic books. It's good enough for infographics, graphic design, that kind of stuff. And smartphone screens are just getting better and better and better to the point where you can't even see the individual pixels anymore. They are literally sharp enough that it doesn't matter. Anything that a human eye can perceive at that distance, yeah, we can draw that. Absolutely not a problem. And in a way, this is kind of sad, because all of these wonderful technologies, like, type punches and linotype machines and ROM generators and character matrices and Don Lancaster's television typewriter, it turns out that all of them were just us solving the fact that computers couldn't really do what we wanted, which is just infinite data, infinite resolution, all the time, broadband on forever on a widescreen display the size of the sky. But, we right here, right now, we are at the convergence of these four wonderful stories. We've got a story that started 5,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia when someone drew a cow's head in a piece of wet clay. We've got a story that started 500 years ago with the Gutenberg press and the invention of movable type. We got a story that started 50 years ago with the first digital bitmap computer displays. And we have the next chapter of I don't know what. I have no idea what is coming next. But something that I love is when science fiction comes true in my own lifetime. And this book, Neil Stephenson, The Diamond Age, was published in the 90s. And I read this when I was an undergraduate in college and thought, wow, this is full of amazing stuff that might happen 200 years after I'm dead. And then I was rereading it on the Kindle recently. And there's a package in this book where it says, at times like this, the paper glowed softly, and the letters stood out crisp and black. And I was reading this on my Kindle at night, and I just had this moment of, holy crap, it actually came true while I was reading it. And that's astonishing, because we live in a world where science fiction is coming true all around us. Somebody sent me this cartoon from 1934, the television newspaper. Someday you might receive the front page of your morning newspaper on your television. Can it be done? Well, yeah, we did that. And so I look at all the science fiction things I grew up with, the world of the future and robots and future cities, and I think, well, we basically solved it when it comes to typography. I wonder how much other awesome stuff out there is going to happen in science fiction that's going to come true within our own lifetimes. Thank you. Do we have any questions, folks? We have a couple of minutes. I like the silence of enlightenment. That's a good note to end the day on. Right, I'm going to go downstairs and plug in a bunch of stuff. We are going to be doing, we got about an hour break now, so go grab some beers, talk to people. Then we're going to have some fun talks. Then we're going to have some guitar karaoke. Then we're going to get all of you up. You're all going to sing songs. We're going to have a big party. It's going to be awesome. I'll see you shortly.